Jake Lawson loved working nights at Meridian Station. As the top mechanic there, he found the quiet hours perfect for his job. With fewer people around, he could focus on fixing the important machines that kept everyone alive in space. The station was huge, floating between the stars, home to thousands of humans and aliens who needed air to breathe, power to run their machines, and ways to talk to each other. Tonight felt like any other night as Jake looked at his work list. 3 broken air systems in the alien quarters, a weird shaking sound in the main power line, and completely dead translation machines in Meeting Room 7. The alien visitors, called Zephyrians, had been living on the station for 6 weeks. They were here to make peace deals that might stop small fights from becoming big wars. Jake didn't know much about politics. He just heard bits of conversation in the cafeteria and at work meetings. But he knew one thing for sure: keeping the aliens' life support systems working was more important than usual. If those machines broke, people could die, and the peace talks would definitely fail. His first job took him to the special area where the Zephyrian visitors lived. These aliens looked almost like humans, but they had pointed ears and glowing marks on their skin that changed colors based on how they felt. Jake's repair manual said these color changes meant something important to their culture, but he didn't need to understand that part to fix their machines. The air maker in room 12 is running too hot, Jake said to himself as he walked into the machine room. He started checking his tools against the computer readings that told him something was wrong. "Is it hot enough to cause real problems?" asked a voice behind him. Jake turned around and saw one of the Zephyrians, a young woman whose glowing marks were pulsing with what looked like curiosity, not worry. "Not dangerous, just working too hard," Jake said. "Probably the humidity sensors are giving wrong information." He started his testing process, noticing that the alien woman was watching him work with real interest. Most people found machine repair boring. "The system is trying to keep the air just right, but it's working harder than it needs to because the sensors are lying to it," Jake explained. "Wrong information makes the system try to fix problems that don't really exist." The woman nodded. "So bad information in any complicated system can cause big problems that make everything work harder for worse results." Jake looked at her with surprise. She understood the problem really quickly. "Exactly right. It's a common issue with connected air systems. One broken sensor can mess up everything. That's actually a smart way to think about how errors spread through systems," the woman said. She spoke standard space language really well, like someone with lots of education. "Are you an engineer?" Jake asked. "I work in making systems better," she replied in the vague way Jake was learning aliens often talked when they didn't want to give details about their jobs. "My name is Lyra, and I think human engineering is really interesting. Your solutions are often more creative than ours, even when our technology is better." Jake Lawson, senior mechanic and professional fixer of things that break at bad times, he said, getting back to work on the air processor. Lyra kept watching his repair work with clear interest. "I have to say, Zephyrian air control systems are really impressive," Jake said. "This processor handles air mixture jobs that would need 3 separate machines in most human setups. Making things work together instead of having backups of everything," Lyra said thoughtfully. "Something like that. Though I notice your people's way creates single weak points that can be harder to find when things go wrong." Jake finished fixing the sensor and started testing how the system responded. Human engineering tends to be more like building blocks, easier to repair individual parts, but also more complicated overall. Different ways of reaching the same goals. Lyra's glowing marks shifted to patterns Jake was starting to understand meant she was thinking hard. Maybe that's what the peace talks are really about, finding ways to combine different approaches instead of saying one way is better than another. Jake finished his repairs and started packing his tools, struck by how Lyra could see connections between technical systems and the diplomatic meetings happening on the station. That sounds way more hopeful than most of what I hear about the negotiations in cafeteria conversations, Jake said. Cafeteria talk usually focuses on problems and difficulties instead of possibilities and opportunities, Lyra replied with what might have been a smile. But I like to think about what could happen if people with different skills work together instead of against each other. As Jake finished his work and got ready to move to his next repair job, he found himself thinking about Lyra's ideas on cooperation versus competition. Her understanding of technical systems was impressive, but her ability to see bigger connections between engineering and diplomacy was even more interesting. Jake had no way of knowing that Lyra was much more than someone who made systems work better. He didn't know that her job with the Zephyrian support staff was a careful lie designed to let the daughter of the High Council watch human behavior without the complications that would come from everyone knowing who she really was. But as Jake moved through the station, doing his usual maintenance work, he found himself hoping his next service call would take him back to the diplomatic quarters. Maybe he would get another chance to talk about technical philosophy with someone who understood both the practical challenges of keeping complicated systems running and the bigger ideas about finding ways for different approaches to work together well. The night shift was definitely becoming more interesting than usual, though Jake couldn't have imagined how much more complex his simple repair work was about to become. Over the next few weeks, Jake's repair calls to the diplomatic area happened more and more often. Whether the Zephyrian air systems really needed that much attention, or whether certain aliens were finding creative ways to request technical consultations, was a question Jake didn't look at too closely. His conversations with Lyra had become the best part of routine repair work, giving him new ways to think about engineering challenges that made even boring calibration tasks more mentally engaging. The power network is fascinating, Lyra said during Jake's fourth visit to room 12, watching him make the energy flow patterns work better to keep the air processors running perfectly. Human systems put flexibility over efficiency. You can send power through multiple paths if one connection breaks. Zephyrian systems put efficiency over flexibility, Jake replied, making final changes to the power matrix. Your approach wastes less energy but creates weak spots if important parts break. Neither approach is better, they're designed for different priorities. Different priorities that show different ideas about acceptable risk versus best performance, Lyra said, her marks shifting to patterns Jake was learning meant engaged intellectual interest. Maybe the negotiations would benefit from similar thinking about trade-offs and complementary approaches. Jake looked up from his work, noticing the sadness in her voice. Are the negotiations not going well? The negotiations are taking much longer than originally planned, Lyra said, moving to the window to look out at the stars beyond the station. I have been away from my family longer than expected, serving in what my people consider a guidance role for our delegation. Guidance role? Jake asked. Providing perspective on human behavior and decision-making processes. Helping our negotiators understand which proposals are real offers and which are diplomatic theater designed to gain strategic advantages. Lyra's voice carried the kind of tiredness that came from dealing with political complexity that had no clear solutions. It's challenging work, especially when separated from the support systems that make such responsibilities manageable. Jake finished his repairs and started packing his equipment, but he didn't want to leave when Lyra was obviously dealing with loneliness and homesickness that her diplomatic duties prevented her from addressing directly. Is there anything I can do to help? He asked, knowing the question went beyond his professional responsibilities, but unable to ignore someone whose intelligence and dedication he'd come to genuinely appreciate. Your willingness to ask is help enough, Lyra replied, though her marks continued pulsing with patterns that suggested ongoing stress and loneliness. The technical discussions provide welcome relief from political considerations that sometimes seem designed to prevent solutions rather than help them. Over the following days, Jake found himself thinking about Lyra's situation, stranded far from family while dealing with complex diplomatic responsibilities that required her to keep professional distance from most people around her. The isolation was obvious in their conversations despite her efforts to focus on technical subjects rather than personal difficulties. During his off-duty hours, Jake began working on a project that combined his mechanical skills with his growing understanding of Lyra's appreciation for systems that balance different approaches to complex problems. Using spare materials from the machine shop and basic building tools, he created a moving sculpture that showed how planetary systems work, small spheres representing different worlds moving in intricate patterns around a central star, their paths connected by delicate mechanical links that demonstrated how separate systems could work together to maintain overall stability. The sculpture wasn't anything sophisticated, just recycled parts and basic engineering principles. But Jake designed it to reflect the philosophical discussions he and Lyra had been having about cooperation between different approaches to problem solving. The planetary figures included representations of various species, each contributing to the stability of the overall system while maintaining their individual characteristics and orbital paths. When Jake's next repair call took him back to the diplomatic quarters, he brought the sculpture with him, wrapped in protective material and accompanied by a brief explanation of its mechanical principles. "I've been thinking about our conversations about systems working together and complementary approaches," Jake said, offering her the wrapped package with the casual tone he used for routine equipment demonstrations. "This is just a simple mechanical model, but I thought you might find the engineering principles interesting." Lyra unwrapped the sculpture with careful attention, her expression shifting from curiosity to wonder as she examined the intricate mechanical relationships that governed the planetary movements. When she turned on the base mechanism and watched the spheres begin their complex orbital dance, her glowing marks shifted to patterns Jake had never seen before, intense pulsing configurations that seemed to tell stories he couldn't understand. "Jake," she said, her voice carrying tones that made his name sound like a formal declaration rather than casual conversation. "Do you understand what you have just given me?" "A moving sculpture demonstrating orbital mechanics and systems integration," Jake replied, though Lyra's reaction suggested his gift had significance that went far beyond mechanical engineering. "It's nothing elaborate, just spare parts and basic mechanical principles arranged to show how different elements can work together to maintain system stability." Lyra continued staring at the sculpture, her hands shaking as she held it with a respect that suggested Jake had given her something considerably more significant than recycled machine parts arranged in aesthetically pleasing configurations. "This is handmade," she said quietly, her voice carrying complex emotions that Jake's understanding of Zephyrian behavior couldn't interpret. "Created specifically for me using your own time and materials, designed to reflect concepts we have discussed together." "Well, yes. I thought you might enjoy having a physical representation of the engineering principles we've been talking about." Jake studied her reaction with growing concern, wondering whether his gift had somehow violated cultural rules he hadn't been briefed on. "Is there something wrong? If I've accidentally caused offense?" "Not offense," Lyra interrupted, her marks now pulsing with rhythms that seemed to resonate through the room's atmosphere. "Recognition. Jake Lawson, by offering me this handmade gift, created with your own skill, given freely without expecting anything in return, designed to honor concepts we share, you have just activated the rite of devotion." Jake stared at her, feeling his understanding of the situation shift as he realized that his simple gesture of friendship had somehow triggered cultural mechanisms he'd never heard of and didn't understand. The rite of devotion, an ancient law that recognizes sacred bonds between individuals who demonstrate trust, respect, and commitment through the offering of personal creations. Lyra's voice carried formal weight that transformed their professional relationship into something considerably more complex. "By accepting your gift, I become bound to protect you from any harm that might arise from our connection, while you become responsible for my welfare and that of my family lineage." As Jake tried to process the information that his moving sculpture had accidentally activated ancient bonding laws that made him legally responsible for the welfare of someone he was beginning to suspect was much more important than her cover identity suggested, he realized that his reputation for creative problem-solving had just created the most complex problem of his professional career. Lyra, he said carefully, when you say family lineage, exactly how extensive a responsibility are we talking about? Her smile was bright enough to trigger the room's emergency lighting systems. That, she said, is something we should probably discuss in considerable detail, Jake. Especially since my full name is Princess Lyra Zanhara of the High Council, and your gift has just made you legally responsible for the safe passage and welfare of one of the most politically significant bloodlines in Zephyrian space. As emergency protocols began activating throughout the diplomatic sector in response to the bioluminescent patterns that indicated a member of Zephyrian royalty had just activated ancient bonding laws with a human, Jake realized that his simple night shift maintenance work had just evolved into something that would either advance interstellar diplomacy or create the kind of political crisis that could restart the very conflicts the negotiations were supposed to resolve. The activation of the rite of devotion triggered immediate responses from both human and Zephyrian security systems, creating the kind of diplomatic crisis that required emergency consultations with cultural experts, legal advisors, and officials whose job was to determine whether unprecedented situations represented opportunities or disasters. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, said Director Martinez during the emergency briefing that had been called in a secure conference room whose privacy systems made their conversation invisible to any surveillance equipment. Our senior mechanic has accidentally entered into a sacred bond with the daughter of the Zephyrian High Council, which grants him legal authority over her family's safe passage while making him a permanent target for elimination by anyone who views human influence over Zephyrian royalty as unacceptable contamination. That's an accurate summary of the immediate implications, Jake replied, though he was acutely aware that the clinical description missed the emotional complexity of his situation with Princess Lyra. Though I should clarify that the bonding wasn't intentional, it was triggered by my gift of a mechanical sculpture that I created as a gesture of friendship and intellectual appreciation. Intellectual appreciation that accidentally created a political situation with ramifications we're still calculating, added Dr. Sarah Chin, the xenocultural specialist who'd been summoned to provide expertise on Zephyrian bonding customs. The rite of devotion is one of their most sacred laws, designed to recognize and protect relationships based on genuine respect and personal commitment rather than strategic alliance. Jake looked around the briefing room at the assembled officials, whose expressions ranged from concern to barely concealed calculation, understanding that his personal feelings about Princess Lyra were now secondary to the political implications of their bond. What kind of authority does the rite actually grant? Asked Colonel Harrison, whose primary concern appeared to be intelligence opportunities rather than diplomatic complications. According to our preliminary research, Dr. Chin replied, consulting her cultural databases, the bonded human gains consultation rights over decisions affecting the Zephyrian family. Lineage, access to protected communication systems, and responsibility for coordinating safe passage protocols. The level of access could provide valuable intelligence about Zephyrian governmental structure and military capabilities. Intelligence that could give us significant negotiating advantages, Colonel Harrison pointed out with the kind of tactical thinking that made Jake uncomfortable about the direction this conversation was taking. Intelligence that was never intended to be used for espionage, Jake said firmly. The rite of devotion recognizes a genuine emotional connection based on mutual respect and intellectual appreciation. Using the access it provides for strategic advantage would violate both Zephyrian cultural law and the spirit of the bond itself. Before the briefing could continue down the path of exploitation versus ethical responsibility, Jake's emergency communicator chimed with an urgent message from Princess Lyra. Jake, we need to meet immediately. There are serious complications developing that could endanger both our delegations. The meeting took place in a secure chamber within the Zephyrian quarters that Jake's bonded status had granted him access to, a space whose crystalline architecture seemed to respond to their combined presence by creating privacy fields and enhanced security protocols. What kind of complications? Jake asked as soon as he saw Princess Lyra's expression, which mixed urgency with barely controlled fear. The kind created by people on both sides who view our bonding as either a threat to eliminate or an opportunity to exploit, Princess Lyra replied, activating holographic displays that showed intelligence reports Jake was certain he wasn't supposed to have clearance to see. Conservative members of my delegation are claiming that accepting your gift represents contamination of royal bloodline authority, while certain human officials are pressuring you to use your new access to our systems for intelligence gathering that could advance human negotiating positions. Jake studied the reports, recognizing names of officials from both delegations whose commitment to successful negotiations had always seemed questionable. They're working together, aren't they? The people who want the negotiations to fail are coordinating across species lines. More than coordinating, they're planning to eliminate both of us before the rite of devotion can be formalized through the traditional ceremonies, making our deaths appear to be the result of cultural violations that would justify ending the peace process entirely. Princess Lyra's marks shifted to patterns that Jake was learning to recognize as controlled fear mixed with determined resolve. The bond has given us access to communication networks that revealed the coordination between war profiteers on both sides who have been deliberately prolonging the negotiations to maintain profitable instability. War profiteers who make money from continued conflict rather than lasting peace, Jake said, feeling pieces click together in his mind as he understood the scope of what they were facing. Using our accidental bonding as either a pretext for elimination or an excuse for resumed hostilities. Exactly. Which means our choice about whether to formalize the rite of devotion isn't just about our personal relationship. It's about whether we can expose this conspiracy before it destroys the peace process and condemns both our peoples to renewed warfare. Jake looked at the evidence Princess Lyra had gathered using their combined access to previously classified information, seeing the financial networks and communication channels that connected supposedly opposing factions in a web of shared interest in maintaining profitable conflict. If we formalize the bond through the traditional ceremonies, we gain permanent access to the systems that could prove this conspiracy exists, he said, thinking through the implications. But we also make ourselves permanent targets for elimination by people who view peace as bad for business. If we allow the bond to dissolve naturally, we lose the access that could expose the war profiteers, while leaving ourselves vulnerable to elimination by people who consider us threats regardless of our formal status. Princess Lyra moved closer, and Jake noticed that the chamber's systems were responding to their proximity by creating enhanced defensive protocols that neither of them could have activated independently. So our choices are: formalize a relationship we never intended to create in order to fight enemies we didn't know existed, or let the relationship dissolve and hope that conventional diplomacy can succeed despite systematic sabotage by people who profit from failure. Those appear to be our options, yes. Princess Lyra looked at him with expressions that held depths of emotion and possibility that made Jake realize their accidental bonding had revealed compatibility that extended far beyond shared intellectual interests. Though I should mention that choosing to formalize the rite of devotion wouldn't be purely strategic. The bond recognized genuine feelings that existed before either of us understood their significance. Jake considered her words, aware that his response would determine not just their immediate survival, but the future of negotiations that could reshape the relationship between their civilizations. Princess, he said quietly, before we make this decision, I need to be completely honest about something. When I made that sculpture for you, it wasn't just intellectual appreciation or friendly gesture. It was personal admiration for someone whose intelligence and dedication to peace impressed me more than I realized until the rite of devotion made those feelings impossible to ignore. Princess Lyra's smile was radiant enough to activate the chamber's bioluminescent response systems. Jake, she replied, when I accepted your gift, it wasn't because of diplomatic courtesy or cultural obligation. It was because receiving something you'd created specifically for me made me understand that the connection I'd been feeling throughout our conversations was mutual rather than one-sided. As alarms began sounding throughout the station, indicating that the war profiteers had decided to move against them immediately rather than waiting for diplomatic solutions, Jake realized that his simple gift of a moving sculpture had become the catalyst for either saving or destroying the peace negotiations while determining whether two people from different species could build something together that was stronger than the forces trying to tear them apart. So, he said, looking at Princess Lyra, whose bioluminescent marks were shifting to patterns that told stories of hope and determination, shall we formalize this ancient bonding ritual while exposing a conspiracy and saving the peace process? I can't think of any gift more precious than the opportunity to build a future together, she replied. And Jake realized that sometimes the most important engineering problems were solved not with better tools or more sophisticated techniques, but with the courage to recognize when two different approaches could create something neither could accomplish alone. The attack came during the shift change when the station's security protocols were at their most vulnerable, launched by coordinated teams of human and Zephyrian personnel whose loyalty to the war profiteering conspiracy outweighed their supposed allegiance to their respective governments. Multiple hull breaches in the diplomatic sector announced the station's artificial intelligence as emergency systems activated throughout Meridian Station. Armed personnel from both delegations are engaging in unauthorized combat operations. All civilians report to secure areas immediately. Jake and Princess Lyra were in the process of preparing for the formal rite of devotion ceremony when the assault began, surrounded by the evidence they had gathered about the conspiracy while hoping to complete the bonding ritual before their enemies could eliminate them. They're not waiting for us to make a decision about formalizing the bond, Jake observed, watching tactical displays that showed the attacking forces moving with military precision toward their location. They've decided that we're too dangerous to let live regardless of our official status, which means our choice is no longer whether to complete the rite of devotion, Princess Lyra replied, activating defensive systems that Jake hadn't known existed until his bonded status granted him access to Zephyrian security protocols. Our choice is whether to die together while the war profiteers succeed in destroying the peace process, or formalize our bond while broadcasting evidence of the conspiracy to every news network and governmental authority in the sector. The formal ceremony was remarkably simple for a ritual with such profound implications, an exchange of vows that acknowledged their mutual devotion and commitment while activating ancient systems that recognized bonds transcending political calculation. As explosions echoed through the station and attacking forces fought their way through defensive barriers, Jake and Princess Lyra spoke the words that would bind their fates together permanently while simultaneously transmitting the evidence that would expose their enemies. I offer you my devotion freely given, my protection willingly provided, and my commitment to the future we can build together, Jake said, his voice carrying across communication networks that reached diplomatic and military authorities throughout human space. I accept the responsibility to honor what we share and defend the peace you represent. I accept your devotion as sacred gift, your protection as cherished bond, and your commitment as foundation for hope, Princess Lyra replied, her words triggering security protocols that transformed their location into an impregnable sanctuary while broadcasting systems throughout the station responded to their bonded presence. I offer you my trust, my partnership, and my dedication to proving that different peoples can create something together that neither could accomplish alone. The moment their vows were complete, the station's enhanced defensive systems activated with authority that neither the human nor Zephyrian attackers had anticipated. Emergency barriers that had been designed to contain hull breaches became impenetrable walls, while communication arrays transmitted evidence of the war profiteering conspiracy to authorities across multiple star systems. This is Admiral Santos of the Human Defense Fleet, came a transmission from loyal forces responding to the evidence broadcasts. We have confirmation of the conspiracy allegations and are moving to arrest personnel involved in the unauthorized assault on Meridian Station. This is High Commander Velnara of the Zephyrian Peace Corps, came a parallel response from their military hierarchy. The treasonous elements within our delegation are being taken into custody, and we are coordinating with human authorities to ensure the safety of all legitimate diplomatic personnel. The trials that followed revealed the full scope of the war profiteering network, financial relationships that connected arms manufacturers with corrupt officials from both governments, communication channels that had been used to coordinate the sabotage of peace initiatives, and profit structures that required continued conflict to maintain revenue streams that had made certain individuals wealthy at the cost of thousands of lives. So, Jake said 6 months later, reviewing reports from the Joint Technical Integration Program while sitting in quarters that had been redesigned to accommodate a human Zephyrian bonded pair, we've exposed a criminal conspiracy, established new oversight protocols for peace negotiations, and proof that mechanical engineering principles apply to diplomatic relationships as effectively as they do to technical systems. An impressive list of accomplishments for someone whose only intention was to give a lonely alien woman a handmade gift to brighten her difficult assignment, Princess Lyra. Agreed, watching their latest joint project, a fusion of human and Zephyrian engineering approaches that had created atmospheric processing systems more efficient than either species could develop independently. Though I should mention that the most significant achievement has been personal rather than political, the discovery that accidentally sacred bonding can lead to genuinely happy marriage. The discovery that the most precious gifts are often the ones that cost nothing but time, effort, and genuine care about someone else's happiness, Jake added. Princess Lyra moved to join him at their quarters workbench, where they had been collaborating on integration projects that combined their respective technical expertise with approaches that neither human nor Zephyrian engineers had previously considered. Jake looked at the prototype they'd been developing, a moving sculpture that demonstrated the harmony possible when different engineering philosophies worked together rather than competing for dominance, and realized that his simple gift 6 months ago had grown into something that was reshaping how both their species approached complex problems. "You know," he said, taking her hand while marveling at the way her bioluminescent marks seemed to pulse in harmony with his heartbeat, "when I decided to make you that orbital mechanics sculpture, the most complicated outcome I imagined was maybe having an interesting conversation about systems integration and complementary design approaches. And instead," Princess Lyra laughed, "you accidentally activated ancient bonding laws, exposed interstellar conspiracies, married into alien royalty, and became responsible for establishing technical cooperation programs that are revolutionizing engineering approaches for both our civilizations." Jake grinned, shaking his head at the trajectory his simple gesture of friendship had created. "It's considerably more complex than routine maintenance work. More complex than you wanted, much more complex than I planned, but exactly as complex as it needed to be," Princess Lyra said. Jake squeezed her hand gently, noting how her marks shifted to patterns that he'd learned to recognize as deep contentment mixed with boundless affection. "Besides, I've discovered that the most important repairs aren't about fixing things that are broken, they're about building connections that create something entirely new." Princess Lyra laughed, her joy creating harmonics that made their workshop's equipment resonate in sympathy. "Even when those connections require learning entirely new approaches to engineering, diplomacy, and interspecies marriage? Especially then. Some problems can only be solved by combining different perspectives and expertise rather than insisting that one way is superior to all others." Jake looked around their workshop, where projects that incorporated both human and Zephyrian engineering principles were creating possibilities that neither species had imagined working independently. As they continued their work on integration projects that were proving the value of cooperation over competition, Jake reflected on how dramatically his understanding of his purpose had evolved. He'd started as someone who kept individual systems running smoothly and had become someone who helped build bridges between entire civilizations. The most important gift he'd ever given had cost him nothing but time and creativity, but it had returned rewards beyond anything he could have imagined, not just in terms of political achievements or technical breakthroughs, but in the simple daily joy of sharing his life with someone who understood that the best solutions came from working together rather than apart.